So this will be the last Shiur on Heter Mechira. So I'm just going to give actually a recap. Michael and Yisachar, excuse me for those people who have been with, and also those that are joining us on Zoom. Excuse me if I'm sounding repetitive, but since Baruch Hashem we have a few new faces tonight. So just to give a bit recap, okay, the Heter Mechira controversy began in 1889, 1899. It was basically the issue of it was actually the reason why this Heter Mechira started to become an issue is because the Jewish people started to buy land in Eretz Yisrael. There was already a Jewish agricultural presence in Eretz Yisrael, so therefore it became very relevant to come up with a heter. It was basically the residents of Petach Tikva. I'd like to also thank Eli, one of our Zoom viewers. Eli drew my attention. There was a young son called Maskeres Batya. Okay, so Maskeres Batya was a very religious settlement. Now, almost all the settlements went along with the Heter Mechira, including the settlements of Heter Mechira, Yisud HaMa'aleh. Basically, they all went along with Heter Mechira. But then there was a certain settlement, the settlement of Maskeret Batya, and actually they were employed somehow or other by Baron Rothschild. Okay? So it became a major controversy that the residents of Maskeret Batya got into a big fight with Baron Rothschild because they said they didn't want to rely on the Heter Mechira. They had very intimate relationships with the rabbis of the Yishuv HaYashan. Rav Shiur Diskin, who was very opposed to the Heter Mechira. So the residents of Maskeret Batya were closely intimate with Rav Shiur Diskin, and somehow because of that they decided they're not going to observe. They're not going to rely on the Heter Mechira. And Baron Rothschild was incensed. Okay, so if anybody wants to read up on the history, I can send you some pages on that. So Eli, he said these guys are a bunch of lazy bums. That's what Baron Rothschild wrote. He said they don't want to work, so they want to, right? But so he wrote to Rav Kalisher. He was furious, right? And he wanted Rav Kalisher to intervene. Rav Kalisher was actually one of the supporters. Not Rav Kalisher, the Yeshua's Malkai. He wrote to the Yeshua's Malkai, and he wanted the Yeshua's Malkai to interfere so that they shouldn't rely on the Heter Mechira. Now the thing is like this, Yeshua's Malkai personally supported the Heter Mechira, but he didn't feel that it was appropriate to tell the residents of Maskeres Batya, right, that they have to rely on the Heter Mechira. He felt that if they were not comfortable relying on the Heter Mechira, they should have the prerogative to do so. Okay, so as I said in 1889, this blew up as a major controversy. Those who supported the Mechira, most notably, was Rav Yitzchak Chanan Spector, who was the Rav of Kovna. He was the foremost posek in his generation. He also had the backing, as mentioned, the Yeshua's Malka, Rav Kalisher, Rav Kook eventually supported it. Who were those that were opposed to it? The Netziv was very opposed to it, the Aruch HaShulchan, the Ritvaz, not to be confused with the Ritvaz. The Ritvaz was Rav Herzog's Rabbi, actually. He was a Rav in Slutsk, and then he was a Rav in Chicago, and then he became a Rav in Tzfat. So he was very, very opposed to that in Mechira. And the Chazon Ish, in modern day time, was also extremely opposed to the Heter Mechira. And we mentioned the other week that the Chazon Ish had basically three grounds for objection against the Heter Mechira. Just to review. The first grounds for objection was because he held that you're not allowed to sell pieces of Eretz Yisrael. Eli also pointed out very nicely, I'll mention Eli's point in just a moment, but before I get to that, the Chazon Ish said there's an issue of like tichanim. That's the reason why the Netziv was a foremost opponent of the Heter Mechira, because you're not allowed to give idol worshippers a foothold in Eretz Yisrael. And that's a violation of like tichanim, as it's delineated in the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, Tav Chaf Aleph, and therefore the Chazon Ish made the following argument. The farmers appoint an agent to sell the land for them. Now, according to the Chazon Ish, the person that is executing the sale is doing an Aveira because he's giving idol worshippers a foothold in Eretz Yisrael. And the halach is Ein Shlich L'Dvar Aveira. If you appoint an agent to do an Aveira for you, what happens is that the agency becomes null and void. And therefore, he says the sale is not even valid because for the sale to be valid, the agent has to actually have if you like to call the power of attorney. So the concept of shliach, of shlichus in halacha is the equivalent of power of attorney. He says if your attorney, as it were, was doing an aveira, so therefore the power of attorney becomes null and void, and therefore the sale is not either effective. So that was the first argument of the Chazon Ish. We said, as you all know, those who have been with us, we said that that's not an issue because as long as you sell it to a nochait, as long as you sell it to somebody who's not an idol worshiper, according to the Sefer Chinuch and the Rambam, they understand that the issue of giving idolaters a foothold in the land is because we don't want to be influenced by them. But if it's not an idol worshiper, then it's fine. You're allowed to sell them pieces of land in Eretz Yisrael. Again, as you know, those who have been with us, we made the argument that a noachite would be the best candidate to sell the land to, because Muslims are not, is an issue, because although we mentioned that the Muslims won't, if a Muslim touches your wine, it doesn't become yain nesach. That's what the Rambam already says. We're not concerned that if a Muslim touches the wine, the Muslims don't, first of all, Muslims don't drink wine, and also wine libations is not part of the Islam religion, it's not part of the Muslim religion, so it's not something that you have to be concerned about. Although we did mention that the ritva, right, already discussed the question, if somebody says you must give up your life or to convert to Islam, must you give up your life? So the Ritva says you have to give up your life in order not to convert to Islam. He says, granted, right, it's not idolatry. You don't have to be concerned that they're going to make your wine yain nesach. He says, but it's still a heretical religion, because Islam doesn't acknowledge the authenticity of the Torah Shebechsav. It doesn't acknowledge the authenticity of the Torah Shebal Peh. Sorry, if you could just whisper, please, okay? So he's saying, so therefore, they're not idol worshippers, but it's still, from the vantage point of Judaism, it's still heretical religion. So according to the Ritva rules that if somebody says either give up your life or to convert to Islam, you have to give up your life. And we said that the Radvaz, in a much later generation, Radvaz was the Av Beis Din in Alexandria. He said in his time, many Jews were being threatened to convert to Islam, and he says they were not giving up their lives, they were converting to Islam because they were under the mistaken impression that you don't have to give up your life in order to convert to Islam. Says the Radvaz, this is a complete mistake. He says you have to give up your life in order to give up to Islam. He says, granted, they're not idol worshippers, they won't make your wine yain nesach, but it's still heretical. Just as you have to give up your life not to convert to Christianity, you have to give up your life not to convert to a religion that denies the authenticity of the Torah Shebal Peh and the Torah Shebechsav. Okay? So therefore I made the argument, this is the third time you're hearing this, I made the argument that if they were to sell the land and they wanted to fully avoid the issue of Leitechanim, they should sell it to a Noachite. Okay? A Noachite, a person that observes the Sheva Mitzvahs B'Noach, the seven Noachite lights. Yes?
Can you appoint the Muslims as your shaliach?
Can you appoint ein shlichus l'goy? Shlichus has to, if you want to use a power of attorney, especially for halachic matters, you need to find a Jewish agent. Yeah. I mean, if you
legally you could.
Yeah, legally. Yeah, din al-malchusa too. Yes, correct. From the vantage point. Yes, from the point of view of a din al-malchusa, right? If according to the din al-malchusa, you appoint a Muslim agent and the government body recognizes that agent, and the government body considers that a legal sale, then yes, then the sale is binding by means of dina d'malchusa dino.
You're able to sell your land for that to the with Lugoy.
Right. So I see. So there's no din of bittul shlichos and a chanami. Yeah. Okay. Very good. And a chanami, but that won't help you avoid the issue of leitichanim. In other words, you won't have the issue of bittul shlichos. And in other words, that if you do a sale that's legally binding according to the government, so therefore you don't have the issue of ein shlich l'dvar ver, because ein shlich l'dvar ver is a halachic concept. There is no such concept. I don't know if there is. There are some manifestations of that idea, but generally speaking, if something is legally binding, then they don't. According to the government, the concept of ein shlich l'dvar is not part of the equation. So, and you're right. The sale would be binding, the sale would be effective, but you still have the issue of Leitechanim that we're not allowed to give idol worshippers a foothold in the land. Okay, so that was the first issue the Chazon Ish had. The second issue that the Chazon Ish had, he said, is because it's not registered in the tablet, it's not in the registry. So we mentioned last week that in 1979, the government solved this problem. Until 1979, the Chazon Ish argued that if let's say the Arab decided that he would want to keep the land that was sold to him, they sold the land to the non-Jew with the sole intent of circumventing the prohibitions of Shvius. Okay? So, says the Chazon Ish, what happens if the Arab decided that he wanted to keep the land? Okay, he comes after the Shemitah year, he says, okay, can we buy it back? He says, you know what, I think that it's a profitable prospect, I'd like to keep the land. An amazing thing. We said 1.7 million dunams sold with 70 billion shekel, and he says, okay, I came up with 70 billion shekel. I called up my cousin in Saudi Arabia, right? And he gave me 70 billion shekel. I like to keep the land. Says the Chazon Ish, he wouldn't be able to enforce it in court because it's not registered in the tabo. It's not part of the land registry. He says if a sale cannot be enforced in court, he says the sale has no bearing. That was the second argument of the Chazon Ish. So what did they do in 1979? The government came along and they changed the law. They said that any sale that's been executed by the rabbinic body, the Rabbanut, he says, will be legally recognized. So that's how they solved the problem. The third issue was, there's no Gemiras Das. He says that they would never, there's no real intent to sell the land. And he says, and don't ask me about selling chametz on Pesach. He says, when you sell chametz on Pesach, nobody wants to violate the prohibition of bal yirah bal chametz. Nobody wants to violate the prohibition of owning chametz on Pesach. So surely, when somebody sells the chametz, he has real intent that it should be a real sale in order to avoid the prohibition. He says, but here, the government would prefer that the entire country observe Shvius as opposed to selling the entire land, so there's no real intent. Those were the three arguments of the Chazon Ish. Okay, so the first argument of the Chazon Ish, that you have a problem of Leit Techanim, find a Noachite to sell the land to, and I think, I'm not sure, I know that in 2007 they sold it to an Arab. I'm not sure if this was an Arab who was a Muslim or not, I'm not sure, but I think that the best issue, that if you want to avoid this problem of Leit Techanim, you sell the land to a Noachite. The second issue, again, as we mentioned, that it's not registered in the Tabo, we said that was solved in 1907, and they put it into Israeli law, that you own the land if the sale was executed by the Rabbanut HaReshit. The third problem is the real intent to sell the land. Okay? Yeah. So this brings us to the issue, I wanted to get into the issue of harama. Now, harama means that you do, according to the Tiferes Israel in Tmura, harama means a tachbula. A tachbula is a loophole, if you'd like. Okay? I looked up two English translations for harama. According to the Art Scroll, harama is a subterfuge. Okay? According to the Steinsaltz, which appears on the Sifri app, it's an artifice. Okay? An artifice. Now, artifice is something that sort of connotes falsehood, right? So the question is, what's harama, right? So I think that in order to nail down the definition of harama, we have to look at some of the examples of harama. Harama is basically using a loophole to circumvent a certain prohibition. Okay, that's what harama is. And most people consider this idea of selling the land of Israel in order to circumvent the prohibition of Shvius, they consider that harama. Are you allowed to use harama? Okay? So,
how do you spell that?
Harama is Hey, Ayin, Reish, Mem, Hey. Okay? So the first example that I chose in your reference sheet is the Gemara in Shabbos Daf Kuf Lamed Tes, where the Gemara talks about a classic example of harama. Now, there was the Gemara number 1 in the reference sheet, so the Gemara retells a story about Amar Rabbanon of Ashi. So the rabbis were incensed. They came to Rav Ashi. Now this is written in Aramaic. So basically what happens is, they came to him and they said, there's a certain young rabbi, a whippersnapper, who's misbehaving. What's his name? Rav Huna ben Rabbi Chiyun Shmei. Some say it was Rabbi Huna Rabbi Chalvan Shmei. Whoever it was, this young rabbi. And the rabbis were incensed by his behavior. So they came to complain to Rav Ashi. He says, what did this young rabbi do? He took a piece of garlic and used that to clog the faucet of a barrel. Okay, that was kind of used to have a faucet on a wine barrel, and he clogged the hole by using a clove of garlic. Now the rabbis forbade this because it resembles fixing. You're not allowed to fix items on Shabbos. So the Chacham considered this something that resembles Shabbos desecration. It looks like you're fixing the barrel, you're clogging the faucet, and he's doing it. And we said, why are you doing this on Shabbos? He says, no, I'm not fixing the barrel. I have this garlic, I have nowhere to put it. I need somewhere to store this piece of garlic. Okay, so he had a cover story for his behavior. The Gemara says that's not all that he did. The Gemara brings another story. He said the Chacham forbade people to cross rivers on Shabbos on a raft or on a boat. Right? Because it might lead to swimming, and if it leads to swimming, you might build a raft, etc., etc. The rabbi said, don't cross bodies of water on boats. Okay? So it's a nice Shabbos activity. I'd like to go on a paddle boat and go on the river. What's wrong with that? What Shabbos desecration is involved in riding a paddle boat on Shabbos? Or says, no, right? You might come to fix something. So it's also another rabbinic prohibition. He went to sleep on the raft. He said they had a certain ferry. There was a river, and there was a non-Jewish person that ran a ferry. And he went to sleep on the ferry. He said, and then he crossed the river. He got to the other side of the river. So they said to him, what are you doing? Why are you traveling on a boat on Shabbos? He says, no. I was very tired. I needed a good place to fall asleep. So I went into the boat. The boat was just the perfect place to catch a nap. And I got to the other side. He says, I wasn't intending to go travel on a boat on Shabbos. So this is called harama. So this was the issue that they had. So Rabbi Ashi said that Harama Ka'amrit, he said, he used a subterfuge, he used a loophole, if you'd like, in the law. He says, Haram b'darbanan. Since the entire prohibition that he was engaged in was only rabbinic prohibition, again, it's not really fixing a barrel. Even if a person put a piece of garlic or a clove of garlic into a barrel, it's not real fixing because it's temporary in nature. It's not a permanent fixing of the barrel. So therefore, the whole prohibition from the get-go is only rabbinic in nature. And therefore, harama, you're allowed to use a subterfuge, a legal loophole, when we're dealing with rabbinic prohibitions. And since he's a rabbi, right, so rabbis don't, if it's a normal person, it might become a slippery slope, right? You start to fix the barrel using a garlic clove. Next week, you're going to take a nail and you're going to take a hammer and you're going to fix it properly, and you're going to violate a Doraita prohibition. But since he's a rabbi and he's smart enough to distinguish between taking a hammer and a nail and fixing a barrel versus sticking a piece of garlic into a barrel, so therefore, since it's only rabbinic in the first place, and he's a rabbi, he'll be able to distinguish between what is really prohibited and what is really not prohibited, so therefore we'll let it pass. Okay? So here you see that there are certain circumstances where we'll allow harama, we'll allow people to use a subterfuge, namely, it's rabbinic. In other words, the whole prohibition that he's circumventing is only rabbinic, number one. And number two, he's a rabbi that could appreciate what's really forbidden and what's really not forbidden. Okay, so that's the principle that we learn in the Gemara and Shabbos. Incidentally, the Rambam permits somebody to put a clove of garlic into a barrel for everybody. The Rambam, in number 3 in your reference sheet, in Hilchos Shabbos Chav Gimel, the Rambam doesn't stipulate that to put he says, the Rambam says, as long as you can use a loophole, you can say, I'm only intending to store the piece of garlic somewhere, I have nowhere else to put the piece of garlic, then you're allowed to do that, and the Rambam doesn't stipulate it has to be a Talmud Chacham. So the Maggid Mishnah explains that the Rambam understood that this requirement that the person be a Talmud Chacham applied only to the second case, when crossing the river, right? That's when you needed to be a Talmud Chacham. But in the issue about putting a piece of garlic into a barrel, according to the Rambam, that you don't even need to be a Talmud Chacham, but that's not the ruling of the Shulchan Aruch, as the Gos Maimonides points out, that's not the way the Torah ruled. Right? Number 7 in your reference sheet, the Shulchan Aruch rules that if you'd like to put a piece of garlic into your barrel and use the cover story that I'm just using it to store my piece of garlic, I'm not intending to fix the barrel. The Shulchan Aruch stipulates that you can only do that if he's a Talmud Chacham. Okay? So that's basically the thing. So if we have a takeaway from this entire issue, the takeaway is this. If you'd like to use a loophole to circumvent a certain prohibition, according to the ruling of the Shulchan Aruch, number 1, it has to be something that's only rabbinic, right, in the first place. Number 2, it has to be a Talmud Chacham. So now, today, we had a long shiur. Today, Shavuos is only Rabbanon. The obligation to refrain from agricultural work is only rabbinic in nature. Why? We already mentioned this at length. The Gemara in Erechin says that Yovel, the Jubilee, is only observed when the people in its entirety are settled in Eretz Yisrael. That's not enough. Every single Jew needs to be settled in their respective plot, their ancestral plot. Only when everybody's in the land, in their ancestral plot, then you observe the Shvi'ah, you observe the Yovel according to the Torah. Okay, it says L'chol Yoshveha, or it says you should observe the Yovel L'chol Yoshveha for all its inhabitants. What does it mean you should observe the Jubilee for all its inhabitants? Sounds a bit redundant. So the Gemara understands that to mean that the Torah is insinuating that you have to have everybody in their respective ancestral plot. Only under those circumstances does Klal Yisrael in its entirety observe the Yovel. And we saw the Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi says that Shemitah is dependent on Yovel. Okay? It says, there's a double language in the Torah, and the Torah says that only when you observe Yovel do you observe Shavuos. And since we're not observing Yovel today on a Deraisa level, we're not observing Yovel altogether. We don't even know when the Yovel is. So that's why the observance of Shavuos today is only a rabbinic requirement. Okay, so therefore, we fulfilled the first requirement. The first requirement has been satisfied. Shavuos is drabanan, so you can use harama. Okay, we're using a loophole to avoid Shavuos. The question is this being executed by a Talmud Chacham? So there's 2 ways to look at it. The farmer that's appointing, sure.
I just want to understand something.
Yeah.
I don't know much about these things.
Okay.
But I just have a question, if you're willing. which is that, intention is often the most important thing in certain situations.
Right.
And when people use a subterfuge or, whatever, like some loophole or whatever, their intention is very different. And they're just using that so they can do the
very good.
So what are we working with here? How did all this come to be?
Very good.
If that is a yisodi kind of...
Very good, exactly. So it's a very good point. What's your name? Mala. So I was asking, what's the whole business of Arama? If a person is not being true, if I understood your question correctly, and you can correct me, so if a person is not being honest about what he really intends to, how could we allow for such a usage? How could we allow for such a taghbula, a loophole, if somebody's not being honest about what his intention is? Okay, so the answer is that, to answer your question, I think that's where we make these two requirements. Number one, it has to be something it's something that the rabbis were stringent about. The rabbis came up and they said, we take the prerogative to forbid people to put pieces of garlic in a faucet to close up the faucet. That's something that, according to the Torah, is completely permissible. And the Torah says, why did the Chachamim make that gzeira? Because the Chachamim said, this week you're going to be putting a garlic, next week you're going to take a nail and hammer. But if you're a Talmud Chacham, and you recognize that two cases are completely different, and therefore it's not the same story, and you have a cover story, so since you're Talmud Chacham, we should have never in the first place made this forbidden for you. Right? You have a cover story, so it won't lead to a slippery slope. So that's why the Chachamim said that we take the prerogative, we take that liberty, because since we were the ones that made it forbidden in the first place, we also take the liberty to give you a permit in a case where you have a cover story and you're a Talmud Chacham who could appreciate the distinction between the two cases. Okay? I hope that answers the question. Okay, so the question is like this: when it comes to shvius, right? Shvius be'emezeh, could you say that on one hand it could be that it's a Talmud Chacham that's executing the sale, but the farmer, there are many farmers that aren't necessarily Talmid Chachamim. So, in as much that we maintain that in order to use a harama, you have to actually be a Talmid Chacham, the farmers may not fit that bill. Presumably, most of them don't fit that bill. Okay, so therefore, it would be problematic to use the mechanism of harama, right? Now, the truth is, I'll tell you what the Rabbi Avad Yosef said. Rabbi Avad Yosef brought a Yerushalmi. It's in Yabi Omer number 8 on your reference sheet. The Yabi Omer, he quoted a Yerushalmi in Beitza, Paragimel Halachei. The Gemara in Beitza discusses the following case. Okay? There's a halacha, you're not allowed to slaughter the mother, let's say a cow. The mother cow and the baby cow on the same day. That's the halacha. You're not allowed to machlokes tanam if it refers also to the father or not, but pashtus, you're not allowed to, according to some of the pashtanim, it's because it's cruelty. Okay? It seems cruel to kill the mother and the child on the same day. That's the way some explain it. Okay? So the question is like this. It's Yom Tov today, and I'd like to shecht an animal so I can have dinner. Rabbi Ashi mentioned, he said, the Shlomo Zalman Auerbach said on the second night of Rosh Hashanah, until I got around to it, was 1 o'clock in the morning. So they didn't have refrigerators. So they had to shech the chicken after the first day of Rosh Hashanah was out already, because you couldn't shech the chicken on the first day of Rosh Hashanah. You're not allowed to prepare on the first day of Rosh Hashanah for the second day of Rosh Hashanah. So as soon as Rosh Hashanah was out, they would shech the chicken, they would salt the chicken, and by the time they had to cook the chicken, by the time the chicken was ready, it was 1 o'clock in the morning. But in principle, that's what they used to do. They used to shech, they used to slaughter animals on Yom Tov so that they could eat. Now the question is they have a mother and the calf have fallen into a pit. I'd like to save them. I'd like to take them out of the pit because I'm worried that the animals will get hurt. I'd like to get both animals out. Now the question is, I'm only allowed to take one animal out. I'm not allowed to be matriach. I'm not allowed to go through a great bother to take both animals out because it's being matriach. It's bothering myself to do something on Yom Tov that has no benefit for Yom Tov. But I'd like to get both of them out. So if I were able to slaughter both, I could take both out. And I can slaughter both. I'll make a big party. I'll invite everybody over for Yom Tov dinner. I'll come to shul. I'll tell the Rabbi, bring everybody home. I have 2 animals to serve. Okay? But he can't shech both animals because I'm not allowed to shech the mother and the calf on the same day. So according to Rabbi Yeshua, you can use a subterfuge. What do? You pull one animal out of the pit. You look at the animal and say, this is a nice animal. You know what? I suspect that the other animal down there is nicer. And then you pull the other animal out. Okay? So in other words, you're just using this as a cover story. Somebody asks you, why are you pulling both animals out of the pit on Yom Tov? You can only really slaughter one. You're not allowed to do that on Yom Tov. So he has a cover story. He says, no, I took out the first one, right? And I said, oh, this animal is nice. And the only reason why I pulled out the second animal is because I thought maybe the second animal was nicer. So the Gemara, it says that we know from another context when it comes to baking on Yom Tov, right? They used to bake matzah on Pesach, right? So there's another issue that came up when baking matzah. How do you take challah on Yom Tov? Right? Challah, you have to separate a piece of dough. Okay, so what are you going to do with a piece of dough? Are you going to leave it? That piece of dough will become chametz. By the way, I was reading in the last article of the Jewish Action that had a very nice article on matzah baking. So today, what happened? Why did we start getting these hard cracker matzahs? This is because they had an issue, right? They had to bake matzahs for the entire community. And if you bake, they used to have these like pizza type of matzahs, but the problem is that these pizza matzahs don't stay fresh. So in order to keep the matzahs fresh, they used to bake these very dry matzahs. Okay? They talked about the taimini minhag, that still today there's a bit of a resurgence to restore it. They freeze them, exactly. So now we have freezers. So today there's been a resurgence of the old minhag, the taiminim. They have a tradition how to bake pita matzahs, soft matzahs, but they need to freeze them because they don't stay fresh. But they describe there that according to historians, that was the woman's job on Chalamot Pesach. He's talking about one historian who went to visit Taman. He said he felt terribly sorry for the woman there. He says it's Yom Tov, right? You'd hope that they get a bit of relaxation. They have no vacation. He says they work harder on Chalamot Pesach than ever before because they spent every day they were baking these pizzas and it was a lot of work. So he felt very sorry for them. So he says so that they really had a major issue. He says, okay, you're going to bake matzah on Chalamot Pesach, but you have to separate challah. What if you have no kohen to give the challah to? So what are you supposed to do? The challah, you're going to leave the challah. What's going to happen? That the challah is going to rise, it's going to become chametz, right? Huh? Well, it could be that today, so that's the problem. You're not allowed to burn challah on Yom Tov. You're only allowed to burn and bake on Yom Tov if it's in order to enable you to eat on Yom Tov. But I'm not allowed to just burn challah on Yom Tov. So there are three opinions in the Mishnah how to do this. One says you separate, you let it become chametz. It's not my problem. It's not mine anymore. That's one solution. The other solution is you throw it into some cold water. That's Rabbi Shua's solution. According to Rabbi Lezer's solution, you bake everything. You first bake it and you only take challah after it's baked. Somebody says, hey, there's a section of the dough that I'm baking that's not going to be consumed on Yom Tov. I'm only allowed to bake things that are consumed on Yom Tov. So how could I bake everything, including the section of the dough, right? So he says you can use a subterfuge. That's what Yerushalmi. It's a subterfuge. He says every single piece of the dough, I could eat this, I could eat that, and there's no specific piece of the dough that I could say with absolute certainty that I'm not going to consume in Pesach. Right? You might find the kohen, right? Okay, but yeah, you might find the kohen. Okay, but it's time where a person becomes tamei. So therefore, the truth is there is a possibility, even in today's day and age, in Chutz La'aretz, to give challah to a kohen, a child. The Ramah says in Chutz Challah that today in Chutz La'aretz you're allowed to give the challah to a child. Okay? Because he's not tamei. Right? There's certain types of tumah that can only be contracted by an adult. Children are not susceptible to those types of tumah. Okay? So there's a possibility to give it to a kohen.
Until bar mitzvah.
Until bar mitzvah, before the age of bar mitzvah. Until 9 actually, before the age of 9. It has to be at the age of 9. According to the Ramah, you can give challah if a child has yet to reach the age of 9. Once a child has reached the age of 9, there's a possibility he could be susceptible to certain types of tumah that occur exclusively amongst adults. Okay, so in any case,
the kid's not going to eat it. You create a kedusha.
No, the kid will eat it. According to the Ramah, in Chutz La'aretz, the kid could eat the challah. Okay, but in any case, I'm getting a little bit off on a tangent. The point is that just to get to the point, the Yerushalmi has a problem. Right? When it comes to the case of these two animals that are stuck in a pit, Rabbi Yeshua allows you to use a subterfuge, a harama. Let's just call it harama. When it comes to the case of baking matzah on Pesach, Rabbi Yeshua doesn't allow you to use harama. So the Yerushalmi is trying to figure out, according to Yeshua, incidentally, according to whom we rule, when are you allowed to use the mechanism of harama, and when are you not allowed to use the mechanism of harama? So the Gemara Yerushalmi says, Rabbi Yeshua allows you to use harama when otherwise you would incur a great loss of Jewish money. Let's say there's a certain dispensation that the Chachamim use for the loss of money. Right? He says the money is precious. Yiddish Geld. Right? The Chachamim were very concerned about Jewish money. So therefore you're going to lose a lot of money. What does that mean? You have these two animals in the pit. If you don't get them both out, one of them could die. So since you need to get those animals out of the pit, chas v'shalom, that one of them shouldn't die, and you might incur a loss of money, so we allowed you to use harama, we allowed you to use a cover story, if you'd like, in order to get both animals out of the pit. Okay? So Rabbi Yosef brings this Gemara. He says the Shvius is the same thing. If we don't employ the heter mechira on Shvius, right, thousands of farmers stand to lose a very great amount of money. So he says you're allowed to use harama, you're allowed to use a loophole in the law to circumvent the obligation to observe Shvius because there's so much Jewish money at stake. Now the truth is, I'm not such a fan of this heter, and I'll tell you why. Because I understand that the Chachamim could waive their prohibition, right, in order so the people should not incur a loss. But when the entire nature of the mitzvah, the essence of the mitzvah is not to be concerned about your money. What is the essence of Shvius? The Torah says, or the Chachamim said in today's day of age, don't be so concerned about the loss of money. Right? Take the leap of faith, trust in Hashem, and the essential nature of the mitzvah is not to be choshesh, not to be concerned about the Jewish loss of money. So I understand the Chachamim would give a dispensation if you lose money because of something incidental. But it would be very strange if the Chachamim would would make an exception and allow you to use harama to avoid a mitzvah when the very essence of the mitzvah is to not be concerned about a loss of money. Do you follow what I'm saying? I'm playing with this idea, but I find that the jump, Rabbi is making a little bit of a jump. Two animals fall into a pit, that's something incidental. You would have much rather those two animals not fall into the pit, and it's unfortunate that those two animals fell into the pit and you're going to lose an animal.
When did they fall again?
They could have fallen on Yom Tov. On Yom Tov they may have fallen into the pit.
If they fell before
so if they fell before Yom Tov and you could have taken it,
If the animal is captive, you're not allowed to do that.
Right.
Put him into captivity.
Correct. Yeah, tzar b'lachayim. You're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to allow animals to suffer. So that's also another, according to the Bavli, that's one of the other variables involved of tzar b'lachayim. So I understand if something incidental happens that causes a Jewish loss of money, the Chacham say, okay, we'll give you an exception, we'll waive our prohibition in order to save a person a loss of money. But here they're using a special dispensation in order to avoid a mitzvah when the whole nature of the mitzvah is not to be concerned about a loss of money, and you're going to say you're going to use haram in such a case? I'm not so sure about that.
How does Prozbul fit into this?
Very good. Excellent. So Prozbul is something we talked about at length. Prozbul is the case in point, is the precedent for this whole heter mechira. Prozbul. Basically, Prozbul is that since the whole issue, Prozbul is to avoid the cancellation of loans. How do you avoid the cancellation of loans? By handing over your rights as a creditor, you hand it over to the court. So now the court's taken over my loans. There's no cancellation of loans that are under the jurisdiction of the court. So I've used a loophole to avoid the cancellation of loans. And the Gemara says it's allowed because it's the whole issue, the whole cancellation of loans today is only midrabanan, so you're allowed to use that. Okay? So that's a good point. Prozbul would be an example where we are using a subterfuge, a loophole to avoid something because if they didn't do that, people wouldn't listen. He says nobody was able to stand up to the test of foregoing their loans. I mentioned this the other week, I think, where there was somebody who became a Baal Tshuva, somebody became religious. And he came to the Rabbi, he says, through all my years of being religious, I never canceled loans. And he says, I'm pretty sure that there were loans that were taken before the completion of the 7th year, and I took the loans back after the completion of the 7th year. Was I allowed to do that? Right? So he came to the Rabbi, he says, maybe I have to track down all those loans that I extracted and give it back. Right? Right? So the question is, we said there's a machlokas achronim. He says, if I take a loan back after the completion of the 7th year, is that gzeila? Is it considered stealing, or is it a failure to fulfill the mitzvah that the Torah required of me? So not necessarily stealing.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, sure.
This is if somebody took a loan from somebody, and they didn't do a prozbul,
right?
And Shemitah ends, right? They owe them $2,000, So what happens then if nobody ever talked about it? So
very good. Thank you for raising that point. So basically the way it works is that if I gave a loan and I didn't write a prozbul, and then the 7th year comes to its completion, so there's a mitzvah on the lender, right? You're supposed to say mishametan. The lender could say, I want to give it back anyways. In other words, the person that gave the loan has to say, Mishamatani, the loan is cancelled. And if after the lender says, I cancel the loan, the borrower says, I still insist on giving the loan back, then they're allowed to. But if nothing happens...
He has to ask for a prosbul.
Yeah, he has to ask for a prosbul. If he never did, then the loan is cancelled. Then the loan is cancelled.
Even today?
Even today, yeah. In fact, it's interesting that they asked the Baal HaMa'or the other week, the Baal HaMa'or, when the great Chacham of Provence, he said, what's going on over here? He says, nobody's cancelling loans. Right? So that's when the Baal HaMa'or has his long tshuva, where the Baal HaMa'or says that today, the observance of Shemitah is only midas chasidus. It's a pious thing to do. It's not even obligatory, according to the Baal HaMa'or. And that's why he has his long tshuva, because they sent him the question, nobody's cancelling loans. And the Baal HaMa'or's reasoning was, it says, since today we don't even observe the Yovel on a rabbinic level, so we don't even have to observe Shemitah. He says, when were they observing Shemitah on a rabbinic level? When they were observing Yovel on a rabbinic level. The Rosh says that when he left France, Germany, he came to Spain, and he said nobody was canceling loans. He says I was very upset about it, but there was nothing I could do. I couldn't convince the people to abandon their wayward ways.
Banks make you sign a prosbul here?
So probably the bank arranges a prosbul.
I don't know. I know there's a heter iska.
They do a heter iska.
Every bank.
Yeah.
I don't know if they make you do a prosbul.
They probably do a prosbul. If they do a heter iska, then the banks probably do a prosbul. Yeah, exactly.
Will you feel when Shemitah is the orator prosbul won't be okay?
When exactly, the Gemara says explicitly that in an age where Shemitah was the right, they would not be allowed to use prosbul. The Gemara says explicitly in Moed Katan. The Gemara says explicitly that the only reason why they were able to use the prosbul to circumvent the cancellation of loans is because that obligation was only rabbinic in origin. Okay.
So if you owe somebody money,
yeah,
and you see Shemitah's coming to an end in another month or two,
yeah,
so and you feel you should pay them,
right,
but they didn't do anything.
right,
And they know everything.
Yeah.
They didn't do anything. So, should you go to them and say, should we write a prosbul so that I still owe you
Right.
money so that it doesn't get
Get
canceled,
canceled, very
so
good.
you don't lose money?
right. That's something very noble to do. You're not obligated to do that, but it's a noble thing to do. That if you're a borrower and you don't want to be in a position where somebody's demanding his loan back, and you're saying, well, I have Shemitah passed, I don't want to have to pay you back. It might be a very noble thing to do, to tell the person maybe you should arrange a prosbul, but it's not something that you have to do. Right? That's not something that's absolutely obligatory.
More saying some places by force.
Yeah.
Something that's good Rabban and all you have holiday now, you have to fight proof like that.
Yes, very good.
So how does this fit?
Yeah. So the Gemara at the beginning of Sukkah, the Gemara says in Sukkah there's something that's a rabbinic prohibition, it needs reinforcement. So sometimes the Chachamim were stricter in upholding the rabbinic. Yeah, the Gemara at the beginning of Sukkah.
So how does this fit in?
As that is the beginning.
So
Correct. So the Chachamim took the prerogative when to be more lenient and when to be more stringent. They said that, for example, in the case of the cancellation of loans, where nobody was observing this, and people were violating Isurim, so the Chachamim took the prerogative to be more lenient because otherwise people would violate what was otherwise Asur. Okay? So the Gemara says, so basically, yeah. So Rabbi Yosef wants to say we're allowed to use haram, we're allowed to use a legal loophole in order to avoid the observance of Shvius because it's a loss of money. I'm not so sure about that. I think I have a better argument I'd like to present why you can use haram in such a case. Okay? So basically, number 13 on the reference sheet, we're going to get now into the whole topic of selling chametz before Pesach. Everybody knows before Pesach comes along, you sell the chametz. So what's the source for this practice? Number 13 on the reference sheet is the Tosefta. The Tosefta talks about Yisrael v'goy shabay mesfina. A typical case, you have a Jew and a non-Jew that were traveling on a boat. V'chametz biad Yisrael, and he has chametz in his hand. So the Tosefta says, he sells it to the non-Jew. Right? Or you can give it to him as a gift. And then the Tosefta says that after Pesach, he can buy it back. Okay? Says the Tosefta, he has to give it as a real gift. I think what the Tosefta is emphasizing, that there has to be real intent to give the chametz. Okay? Because if there's no real intent, I always wondered when I was listening one year, I mentioned to this the other day, when I was listening, they have on the radio, they record the public ceremony where they sell the chametz, where the government, where the representative of the state, I think it's the chief rabbis, they sell it to the non-Jew. I think it's some sheikh from Abu Ghash, I believe. So they have it recorded on the radio live. So the Arabs, after having bought the chametz for the entire country, so he said, Bezrat Hashem, he said, next year Mashiach will come and you won't need to sell the chametz. So I was thinking to myself, my gosh, he doesn't have any clue about what Mechiras chametz is. What does Mashiach have to do with selling the chametz? Okay, but it doesn't matter. As long as it's legally binding, his intent isn't such an issue.
But it was, I think, 20 years, Israel was selling their chametz to Arabs who it turned out
to be Jewish.
Arab had
Jewish mother
or grandmother, something that he was really Jewish.
Right. So what's your name? Remind me what your name is? Madeline. So Madeline just mentioned, I believe I also heard this, that for 20 years they were selling into an Arab, and it turned out that his mother or his mother's mother was Jewish, and therefore it turned out he was actually Jewish. Okay? It's a problem.
So what happened?
So then there's nothing to do anymore. It's too late to fix the problem.
So all that chametz was never sold.
Well, they were shogeg. They're not going to be held liable. They're not going to go to Halachic. Like he's saying, but it's unfortunate. Yeah. There's nothing too late to fix the problem.
The same problem in the States. The biggest wholesale food distributor in the entire country.
Turned out to be Jewish. Okay. By the way, the biggest issue of chametz is the duty free, because it's extremely strange is that the Jewish duty frees here in the airport are selling their chametz, but on Chalamot Pesach they're open selling whiskey. So I find it's very strange. You know, you have an Avrech, he goes into the bakery in Kiryat Sefer, and he starts asking the baker, when were they toching the flour and things like that. I object to that whole practice. I object to the whole practice. The Chasam Sofer says that if somebody objects to the sale of chametz ro lagari, he should be rebuked. He says this is a Jewish practice. It should not be questioned. It shouldn't be matal safek. You shouldn't shake the foundations of a Jewish minhag to sell chametz. Yeah. So he's saying, but here they go into the bakeries, that they grind the flour. Even the flour is probably not even chametz today anyways. And then they go to the duty free and they buy whiskey at the duty free. Right? It's totally right. Duty free chametz is mamish chametz Rabbi Pesach.
Some of those expensive bottles of chametz Rabbi Pesach 30 years.
Yeah, exactly, 30 years. So there's a big discussion, how long does it take for a duty-free to sell out all of its whiskey, to go through, some claim it's 2-3 months. I've never looked into it, but it's something that you have to look into if you're allowed to it's not so simple after Pesach to go buy duty-free in the airports in Israel. This could be chametz Rabbi Pesach. Okay, so that's halacha psuk in Shulchan Aruch that you could sell the chametz on Pesach. Now it's number 17 in the reference sheet. Look at the Bahag. Okay, the Bahag I think was one of the earliest written works after the completion of the Talmud. Okay, the two earliest written works that we have after the Talmud I think is the Bahag and the Shultas Rav Chai Goyen. And I think they lived about 400 years before the completion of the I think it was probably in the year 600 probably. Yeah, they were the early Gaonim period. Right, so the Bahag and the Shultas Rav Chai are two important works that come from the period of the Gaonim. So the Bahag is a very important work, the Baluchas Kedelis. So number 17. So the Bahag quotes this Mishnah, quotes this Sefta about selling your chametz to a non-Jew. So he comes with an important line, says the Bahag at the end, Ubavad Shalayarim. What does that mean? As long as you're not intending to use a subterfuge, as long as you're not doing this just nothing more as a cover story, nothing more, that you're not really being sincere. So the Beis Yosef quotes the Rabbi Yerucham, what do you mean Bavad Shalayarim? The whole business is one big subterfuge. What do you mean Bavad Shalayarim? Right? Sell your chametz to the guy.
He doesn't buy it back.
Exactly, unless you don't buy it back. So I'd like to present the following explanation. If you look at number 19, the Tiferes Yisrael, number 19, the reference to the Tiferes Yisrael in Tmura, it says there are actually two types of aroma. There are two types of subterfuge. He says one is a tachbula. It's a loophole, but it's a legal loophole. Anybody has a good accountant, he'll find a good legal loophole to avoid having to pay taxes, which is fine, as long as it really is kosher according to the law, right? According to the letter of the law, you don't need to pay taxes. It's fine. He says that's one type of harama. He says there's another type of harama which smells of dishonesty. There's an element of dishonesty there. I think it's starting to relate to the point I think it was bothering you before. So he says that's the harama that's also. So first of all, I think consider this a very important point that according to the Yisrael, there actually are two categories of loopholes, right, through which we can circumvent a certain prohibition in the Torah. I'll give a classic example of a problematic loophole is the Gemara in Moed Katan. For example, you're allowed to make beer on Chalamod. But you're only allowed to make beer, right? There's a reasonable chance that's going to be consumed on Yom Tov. Okay, you wouldn't be making beer on Chol Hamoed Pesach, but you could be making beer unless you make date beer on Chol Hamoed Pesach. You can be making date beer. So the Mishnah in Moed Katan Daf Yud Beis permits you to brew as much beer that you need for the Yom Tov. Right? Says the Gemara, they were Bavad Shalayarim. What does it mean, Bavad Shalayarim? Rashi says you shouldn't make a lot. He says, hey, what are you doing brewing 50 barrels of beer? No, I'm going to be drinking lots of beer. Right? I'm going to be throwing lots of parties. He says, so how much of an alcohol could you already be? 50 barrels of beer? Right? You kill yourself with alcohol poisoning. So that's being dishonest. In other words, a person wants to make lots and lots of beer, and he gives a cover story that he's making all this beer for Yom Tov, when in his heart of hearts he knows that there's no chance that he's going to be able to drink that much beer on Yom Tov. So that is already a problem, because there's an element of dishonesty. Ein piv v'libay shavin. So when there's an element of dishonesty, when a person is not speaking 100% sincerely, then generally speaking, such a subterfuge is forbidden. The one exception is, or maybe the few exception is, when the whole thing is only a rabbinic safeguard. And he's a Talmid Chacham that doesn't need this rabbinic safeguard. He's allowed to use a cover story. That's the only time we'll allow this subterfuge to pass. But otherwise, when you're not being honest, right, when you claim that you're making the beer for thousands of people and you know that there's no way that you're going to be able to drink that much beer on Yom Tov, that's something that generally we forbid. He says, but the sale, right? A sale, there's nothing dishonest about it. I'm selling the chametz to the guy. It's a 100% effective sale. In fact, if the guy changes his mind after Pesach and decides that he wants to keep the chametz, he's allowed to. Right? It's a right that he's able to uphold. So he's actually able to keep the chametz. That's what I believe that Rabbi Heinemann in Baltimore, he sends the non-Jew every Yom Tov to a few Jewish homes to collect the chametz. One of the people here that should maybe mention that he just sends the guy to check the chametz, but I heard the story that he actually takes the chametz. I'm not sure, either way. He takes some chametz, he takes a bag of pretzels or whatever. Okay? So he's saying, so therefore, if it's an absolute sale, it's a legal loophole. So that's the type of harama. It's a different category of harama. There's one type of harama which is problematic because there's an element of dishonesty there. The person is not speaking sincerely. What he's saying is not what he really intends in heart of heart. So therefore, generally, such harama is forbidden. But when it's an absolute mechira, there's nothing wrong. So I therefore think that there's no difficulty with the bahag. That's what the bahag said. Ubuvat shalayam, the bahag meant to say it has to be an absolute sale. Based on this bahag, the Shulchan Aruch holds that you shouldn't make any stipulations with the sale. If you sell it to the guy, I'm making a million stipulations, which makes it impossible for him to ever enforce or to ever bring his purchase to fruition. So that shows that you're not really honestly selling. But as long as you are honestly selling the chametz, even though there's this unspoken understanding between the two that you're going to take it back, that's a harama which is kosher v'yosher. The Bachar Shar, one of the early poskim, number 23 in the reference sheet, he says that aside from selling chametz on Pesach, they were doing something else. They were taking an animal, and generally speaking, animal feed had to come from chametz. By the way, this is an important point. Somebody was studying out on the WhatsApp chat. He says a lot of people go to the petting zoo as a chalamoid trip on Pesach. So you put $1 or whatever into the machine, you thing it, and then you get the feed, and then the kids get to feed the goats. He says a lot of this feed has chametz gomer, and people don't realize they go to the petting zoo, they're purchasing chametz on Pesach. They're owning chametz on Pesach. So this is something that somebody was spreading awareness about, to be careful. Right? You're not allowed to own chametz. So the Bachar Shar says a lot of animal feed consisted of chametz. So what do? The alternative animal feeds were very expensive or were not good for the animals. So what they used to do is they actually sell their animals to a non-Jew for the week of Pesach, and then the non-Jews would be feeding the animals over the course of Pesach. They'd be feeding the animals chametz. So the Bachar Shar came along and objected to this whole practice. He says, selling chametz is one thing. Why? Because in addition to selling the chametz, you're also mavatal, you also disown. So if you disown the chametz, right, then you're just doing the sale as an extra precautionary measure. Once you sell the chametz, the whole thing, once you disown the chametz, so the whole prohibition of having chametz in the home after you disowned it is only a rabbinic issue. So therefore, as an extra safeguard, will allow you to sell the chametz. But here it's more of a serious issue. Right? Here, right, if you sell the animal and you actually own the animal, then your animal is eating chametz. He said, therefore, it's a deraisa prohibition, so the B'charsha objected to the whole business. Although most of the poskim didn't accept this objection from the B'charsha. Number 24 in the reference, the Shulchan Aruch Rabbi says he totally disagrees with it. He says you can sell your animals too. He says, what does that mean? You're disowning the chametz. He says, what happens first? If you're disowning the chametz first, then there's no chametz to sell. Correct? And if you're selling the chametz, you can't disown it. So he says you can't be employing both halachas. He says either you're selling the chametz or you're disowning the chametz. And therefore the Shulchan Aruch Rabbi disagrees completely. He says when you sell the chametz, it's actually even to circumvent a deraisa prohibition. I mentioned the story the other week about Rabbi Aryeh Leib Auerbach in Harnof. Now today most people don't sell chametz gomer. Most people don't sell actual chametz, but some people still do. The makolets, the shops certainly do sell chametz gomer. So the guy forgot to sell his chametz. He had a pantry full of pasta, full of pretzels, and he was already heading up north to spend the Yom Tov with his parents up north. And he realizes that he didn't disown his chametz. Okay? So he called up, Ra'ilib called up his uncle of Israel and Beit Vegan. Ra'il says that the halacha is, the Mishnah Pesachim says, if you're going to do a mitzvah, it's enough just to disown the chametz. You don't have to. Disowning the chametz will be enough. If you're going to do a mitzvah, he's going up north to spend Yom Tov with his parents. It's a mitzvah of kibbud avim, so it will allow you to disown the chametz. But the ruling of the Shulchan Aruch Rabbi is that we rely on mechiras chametz. We rely on the selling of the chametz, even to circumvent a potential isur daraita, even to circumvent what would otherwise be a full-fledged deraisa prohibition, not like the B'charsha. That's also on Yom Tov. He asked the same question. He says the B'charsha doesn't make any sense. Right? If you disown it, there's nothing to sell. If you sell, there's nothing to disown. So therefore, that's the ruling of the Einig Yom Tov, the ruling of the Chasam Sofer and Siman Samach Beis. And therefore, he says you're allowed to use this harama to circumvent a deraisa prohibition. Now, but the B'charsha had a difficulty. Ask the B'charsha, if we're using the mechiras chametz to circumvent the deraisa prohibition, how can we use harama to circumvent the deraisa prohibition? Didn't the Gemara in Shabbos, the Gemara in Shabbos that we began with, you're only allowed to use a harama to circumvent a rabbinic prohibition? So, Rabbi Shalom, what's going on? People are selling their pretzels, they're selling their pasta, they're selling all of their chametz before Yom Tov, right? And they're using harama, they're using a loophole to circumvent the deraisa prohibition. How does that work? How could such a thing be done? Says the Makar Chaim, I had to look quite a bit to find this. You know who wrote the Makar Chaim? The Nesivos. Right? You know the Nesivos, there was the Gadol Hadar, the Nesivos. He lived in the same generation as Rabbi Kiva Eger. You know the famous story with Rabbi Kiva Eger and the Nesivos on the wagon? Famous story. I don't know if it's true, but that's the story. Right? He says that when he came into town, the Rabbi Kiva Eger, they were best friends.
He was driving the wagon, so they thought he was the Balagola.
Yeah. So the story goes that Rabbi Kiva Eger and the Nesivos were heading to town, and word spread that the Gedolei Hadar, Rabbi Kiva Eger and the Nesivos were coming to town. So the entire town came out to greet them. So Rabbi Kiva Eger's on the wagon and says, wow, the entire town came out to greet the Nesivos. I also want to pull Lagala. So they had a custom, they used to release the horses, and the people used to pull the horses to show honor to the great rabbis. He says, wow, they're pulling the wagon for the Nesivos. So he jumped out of the wagon and pulled the wagon. And the Nesivos says, wow, the whole town came to pull the wagon for Rabbi Kiva Eger. He jumps out of so the Nesivos, the Rabbi Kiva Eger and the entire town are pulling the wagon, and there's nobody there. Okay, that's the story, okay? He was a very great man. He had a terrible marriage. Rabbi Kiva Eger had to convince his wife his wife didn't want to take a divorce from him. She gave him a lot of trouble. So Rabbi Kiva Eger begged her to accept a divorce. She said, how can I get divorced from such a holy man? Right? So they say over from Rav Shach, he says, she recognized how holy he was, but she still gave him a lot of trouble. Okay, so there's no thing. Okay, so that's the Nesiv. So Nesiv says what we said before. He says the whole kasha of the B'charsha is not a kasha. He said, how could you use harama to circumvent the deraisa prohibition of chametz? He says it's not the same harama. There's two types of harama. One type of harama is the problematic type of harama. She'ein libu v'piv shavin. The person's making barrels and barrels of beer. He's making 100 barrels of beer. He claims that he wants to make a big party on Pesach, and in his heart of hearts, he knows that there's no way he's going to consume all that beer on Pesach. That's what the harama that we don't allow, because there's an element of dishonesty. He's not being sincere. He's not being honest about what he's thinking about. But if it's a mechira gemura, if it's an absolute sale, there's no issue of harama. Okay? That's why the Trumas Hadeshen and the Shutar Advaz, they already asked, number 20 and number 29 in the reference sheet, they already asked the Trumas Hadeshen, they said, if there's an unspoken understanding between the Jew and the non-Jew before Pesach that the guy is never going to take the chametz, is it a problem? She says it's not a problem. As long as it's a chira gemura, as long as it's an absolute legal sale, then it's fine. Okay? So therefore I say as follows. I say when it comes to the heter mechira, I'd like to make the same argument. You don't have to say what Rabbi Ovadia Yosef is saying, that it's mishum hefsed mammon. If it's a real, legally binding sale, when you sell the land to the non-Jew, and it's a real sale that's really effective according to the halacha, even if he doesn't intend, it doesn't matter. Even if it's harama, it's a harama which is no different than the harama of selling the chametz of Pesach. However, the problem is that the Chazon Ish made the argument that it has to be able to be enforceable by law. So I say as follows. If it's enforceable by law, if it is really, according to the law in 1979, it's enforceable by law, which means, say, theoretically, if a guy, after the year of Shvi'ah, says, I want to keep hold of the 1.7 million dunams of Eretz Yisrael, I like to keep it, if he'd be able to uphold that right in a court of law, so his sale is legally binding. Even if he didn't intend, even if there was no real intent, it doesn't matter. If he could enforce that in law, he can show the deed. He says, look, I own 1.7 million dunams in Eretz Yisrael. I'd like to enforce that right. So that means they say, Dina da Malchusa Dina. According to the Dina of the Malchusa Dina, it's a real effective sale. That's the end of the story. It doesn't matter. Again, once you have Dina da Malchusa Dina, the ownership of land operates according to the local law of the land.
So we've accepted the fact that selling the land to a guy makes the payers
out of Kedusha Shvi'ah. Well, that's another controversy that occurred 500 years ago, right? We're already past. This is all assuming that selling the land to a non-Jew indeed uproots the Kedusha of the land. Now, somebody wanted to say the Ran in Durham said there is no Dina D'Malchusa Dina in Eretz Yisrael. He says because the whole Dina D'Malchusa Dina is based on the fact that the king owns the land. It's his turf. He can say he can do what you want. She says in Eretz Yisrael, nobody can own Eretz Yisrael. Eretz Yisrael belongs to every single person individually. You don't know where your ancestral plot is, but if you knew where your ancestral plot is, you would be able to keep it. And no king, no governmental body would be able to take you off of your land. So the Ran wanted to say there's no Dina D'Malchusa Dina in Eretz Yisrael. But the Chasam Sofer we saw last week says that's only one type of Dina D'Malchusa Dina. There's another type of Dina D'Malchusa Dina. And that's what the Rashbam and Bava Basra, Daf Nun Daled explain. That there's a collective agreement, society agrees, that we're going to operate according to a certain system of law. And according to the system of law, if you register a piece of land with a notary, then it's yours. Okay? Or if the government says that the Rabbanut HaReshit has the authority to sell land, then that's the type of Dina D'Malchusa Dina that operates even in Eretz Yisrael. The Dina D'Malchusa Dina where a person can just say, get off the land, I'd like to take it, you can do what he wants. That's the type of Dina D'Malchusa Dina that doesn't exist in Eretz Yisrael. But the Dina D'Malchusa Dina, where there's a collective agreement in society that we're going to operate according to certain laws, that exists even in Eretz Yisrael. And if the law in Eretz Yisrael says that, theoretically speaking, if that guy who bought 1.7 million dunams in Eretz Yisrael, if he would be able to enforce that in a court of law, then by merit of Dina D'Malchusa Dina, he owns the land, even if there was no Gemiras Das, because Dina D'Malchusa Dina says it's his. Follow what I'm saying? So I think that the entire question of the heter mechira boils down to this one point. What would happen? You have to ask the legal expert. What would happen if the guy, after the year of Shemitah, decides he wants to keep the land? I remember when the Greek church, they own lots of land here in Jerusalem, in Chavia, they own lots of land.
And if he could, then what would you say?
So if he could, then heter mechira is valid, even without Gemiras Das, because Dina D'Malchusa Dina. And then the Greek church was already selling the land for quite a bargain. So I remember when I was reading in the paper, they said they interviewed some of the representatives of the Greek church. So the representative of the Greek church said that the reason why they're doing this is because they're concerned that their legal rights won't be upheld. Okay? So I don't know what that means.
Why would it get Gemiras Das punishable way? You're doing something and everything is kosher to yosher. So in his mind, I know he's going to get
right.
that.
So there's a good point. So Dvarim Shabbalei and Dvarim. So you know what it reminds me of? He says that. So they say if there's a hachacha, the whole thing is an hachucha tluya. Right? If you have pieces of evidence that compelling, convincing pieces of evidence that there's no real sale going on, then you have a real issue. But again, once you have the operation of Dina D'Malchusa Dina, again, as I mentioned, it reminds me if somebody said that the government is making reforms for conversion So the government said that one of the arguments went is that if the non-Jew comes in front of the Beit Din and he says, "I'd like to become Jewish," now he's bluffing. Right? The whole thing is one big bluff. He doesn't intend to keep a mitzvah a day in his life. Rabbi Gorin had the Langer twins in the Tzahal, not the brother and sister, if twins or not. He said that they were born from their mother's second marriage. He says that the mother's first husband, she never got a get from him, but he says he wasn't Jewish because the first husband was allegedly a convert to Judaism who didn't keep mitzvahs one day in his life. So the argument went that, okay, it's Dvarim Shabalev, right? He's bluffing his way in the Beit Din. He says, I'm going to keep mitzvahs. He doesn't have a single intent to keep one mitzvah day in his life. So it was a Dvarim Shabalev and a Dvarim. Sort of comes along of Chaim Ozer Grudensky, and he says, that's not a taina. Because certain things, the whole mahus, the whole definition of the act is defined by your intention, like Geirus. Conversion to Judaism is defined by your commitment in your heart to become Jewish. So you can't say Dvarim Shabalev and Dvarim when the entire essence, when the entire nature of whatever's happening is something that occurs in the lev. Yeah, exactly. Kavan and davening, exactly. I davened the whole Shemoneh Esrei. I was spacing out the entire Shemoneh Esrei. You can't say Dvarim Shabalev and Dvarim because that's the entire definition. So it could be that a sale, there has to be some sort of real intent, unless Dinat Machus says that it's his. Right? If a person signs an apartment in the notary and says, I never had Dvarim Shabalev, sorry fellow, the Dinat Machus says that if you sign at the notary, the apartment is yours. It's yours. Okay? So I will stop the show here. Thank you.